1922. 6 lives on one farm. Prints led to the door. A single tool. 6 victims. The killer stayed. For days. Who was the ghost?
Imagine a remote German farm nestled deep in the Bavarian countryside, a place seemingly untouched by the outside world, where the rhythm of life was dictated by seasons and toil. But in the spring of 1922, this isolated haven became the stage for one of the most chilling and inexplicable crimes in history. 6 lives brutally extinguished, a killer who vanished without a trace, and a mystery that has haunted generations: the Hinterkaifeck Murders. This isn't just a story of murder, it's a terrifying exploration into the unknown, a case riddled with strange occurrences before, during, and after the gruesome act. Footsteps in the snow leading to the woods, but none coming back. A phantom presence haunting the family for months, and a crime so baffling it defies every attempt at explanation. Tonight, we delve into the darkness that enveloped Hinterkaifeck, piecing together every detail, every whisper, every chilling, unanswered question. Prepare to step into the farmhouse of death. Our story begins in the early 20th century, specifically the year 1922, in a tiny German hamlet known as Hinterkaifeck. The name itself translates roughly to behind the Kaifeck woods, perfectly describing its utter isolation. It wasn't a village, but a single farmstead comprised of the main house, a barn, and a few outbuildings, standing alone amidst fields and a dense forest. This was Bavaria, a land of deep traditions and close-knit communities, yet Hinterkaifeck existed on its own terms, a world unto itself. Life here was hard, dictated by the land. The family who owned and operated Hinterkaifeck was the Gruber family, and their story, even before the murders, was complicated, fraught with whispers and darker undertones. At the head of the house was the patriarch, Andreas Gruber, a man in his early 60s, known in the local community for his difficult temperament and miserly ways. He was the head of the house, and his authority was absolute. His wife was Kezia Gruber, the matriarch, a woman of quiet endurance. Then there was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, a woman in her mid-30s who had returned to the farm. Victoria had 2 children, the bright and spirited 7-year-old Kezia Gabriel, and the youngest victim, 2-year-old Josef Gruber. The darkest shadow over the family was the open secret of an incestuous relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria, a relationship that had even led to their conviction years earlier.
Many believed the youngest child, Josef, was the result of their continuing abuse. This disturbing background meant the Hinterkaifeck family was not only geographically isolated, but socially ostracized, surrounded by local gossip and resentment. In the months leading up to the end of March 1922, a chilling series of inexplicable events unfolded, suggesting the family was not alone on the farm. It was as if a slow, creeping dread had settled over Hinterkaifeck. The first clear sign of trouble came around 6 months before the murders. The maid at the time abruptly quit. She reported hearing strange, terrifying noises coming from the attic, like footsteps moving directly above her. She became convinced the house was haunted or that someone was secretly living above them. She fled the farm, unwilling to stay another night despite the financial security the job offered. The intrusions escalated. In March 1922, the patriarch, Andreas Gruber, began noticing things. First, he found a newspaper in the house that had come from Munich, a publication to which no one in the remote area subscribed. He searched for the postman, believing it was a delivery error, but soon realized no one in the vicinity had lost a paper. Someone had deliberately left it on the farm. It was an anonymous sign that they had been there, inside the home. Then came the footsteps. Just days before the murders, Andreas made a startling discovery in the snow-covered yard. He saw a set of footprints leading from the forest directly up to the door of the farm's machine room. The door to this room had a recently broken lock. But here is where the story truly turns unnerving. Andreas followed the tracks, searching the fields and the forest edge, but there were no footprints leading back out of the snow. It was as if the person had simply vanished into thin air or, more chillingly, had entered the house and never left. He told a neighbor about the discovery, mentioning his profound unease. He confessed he had checked every outbuilding, searched the entirety of the property, yet found nothing. He refused any offer of help or assistance from the neighbors, clinging to his stubborn self-reliance. He didn't report the incidents to the police, perhaps out of a stubborn pride or a fear that his family's complicated history would bring unwanted scrutiny.
On the very same night as the unexplained footprints, the family was certain they heard the footsteps again. This time, they were clearly audible overhead in the attic. Andreas, armed with a rifle, searched the attic thoroughly, even climbing up to the very rafters, but again he found nothing. The noises stopped the moment he went up, only to resume once he came back down. The feeling of being watched, of having an unseen guest living in their house, was now palpable. These were the final days of the Gruber family. They lived under a pall of fear, knowing that an intruder, a phantom, or a threat was lurking in the shadows of their own home. The stage for the tragedy was set on Friday, March 31st, 1922. It was on this afternoon that a small flicker of normalcy returned to Hinterkaifeck. A new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived to take up her duties, escorted by her sister. Her sister would soon leave, unknowingly becoming the last person to see the 6 victims alive. Maria had no way of knowing that the previous maid had fled in terror. She had only been at the farm for a few hours before the killer, who may have been waiting for this very moment, decided to strike. The timeline of the murders remains a reconstruction, but the brutality suggests a cold, methodical plan. Late that evening, around the time the family would have been settling down for the night, the killer made their move. The common theory, supported by the positioning of the bodies, is that the killer lured the family out to the barn, one by one. The killer may have used a noise, perhaps the unsettling sound of cattle being disturbed in the stable, to draw the family out. Because the barn and the house were connected, it would have been a quick, short walk for each person, but the fatal walk led them to a pitch-black barn. The first victim is believed to have been Andreas Gruber. He may have been the most likely to investigate the noise. Once he stepped inside the dark barn, the killer was waiting. The weapon used was a mattock, a type of tool resembling a pickaxe, heavy and blunt, which Andreas himself was known to keep on the farm. With swift, merciless blows to the head, the killer struck, silencing the old man instantly. Next, his wife, Cecilia Gruber, was lured out, Perhaps she was wondering why her husband hadn't returned, or perhaps she too heard the commotion. She met the same fate as her husband in the dark. The third victim was Victoria Gabriel, the daughter. She too fell to the mattock. The most heart-wrenching loss in the barn was the 7-year-old girl, Kazelia Gabriel. She was the fourth and final victim in the barn. Autopsy reports later suggested she was still alive for a short time after the attack, and tragically, clumps of her own hair were found clutched in her hands, indicating a final, desperate struggle. With the 4 family members dead in the barn, the killer moved into the living quarters of the house. Inside, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was likely asleep in her bedchamber. She had no connection to the family's dark past. The killer found her and ended her life with the same brutal efficiency. Finally, the killer turned their attention to the last victim, 2-year-old Joseph Gruber, asleep in his bassinet. The youngest and most innocent life was extinguished, bringing the count to 6. The murder weapon, the family's own mattock, had been used 6 times to deliver the fatal blows. What separates the Hinterkaifeck murders from nearly every other crime is what happened next. The killer did not flee into the night. They stayed. After the final blow, the farmhouse became a silent, macabre stage. The killer, instead of disappearing, remained on the property for at least 3 days. This is perhaps the most chilling detail of the entire case. The killer carried out daily tasks. The cattle were fed and cared for. The bread from the kitchen was consumed. Neighbors would later attest to seeing smoke curling from the chimney, indicating the stove had been used and the house was warm. On Saturday, April 1st, the day after the killings, a pair of coffee salesmen arrived at the farm to take an order. They knocked, but no one answered. They walked away from the scene, completely unaware that 6 bodies lay just a few meters away.
Later that night, an artisan named Michael Plokel passed by the farm. He noticed the smoke coming from the chimney and the glow of a light inside the house. As he approached, someone inside quickly flashed a lantern toward him, momentarily blinding him and warning him away. Plokel, unnerved, quickly continued his journey, dismissing it as a rude, unfriendly family member. For 4 agonizing days, the silence of the farm was mistaken for life. The community began to notice the inconsistencies. The elder Kazelia had not appeared for Sunday worship. The 7-year-old Kazelia had missed school on both Monday and Tuesday. It was this growing unease that finally prompted an action. The mechanic, Albert Hoffner, arrived on April 4th to repair a farm engine. He waited for an hour, calling out for the family, but heard nothing. Assuming they were simply gone for the day, he proceeded to fix the engine himself and left after 4.5 hours, having spent all that time working within earshot of the bodies in the barn. The failure to appear for social obligations and the repeated silence finally compelled a neighbor, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, to send his son and a stepson to the farm. When they reported back that they had seen no one, Schlittenbauer, who had a personal, complicated history with Victoria, gathered 2 other neighbors and headed to Hinterkaifeck. The discovery and the tainted scene, April 4th, 1922. It was around 3:30 p.m. on Tuesday, April 4th, 1922, when the 3 neighbors arrived at Hinterkaifeck. They searched the house first, finding it strangely empty and neat. Schlittenbauer, guided by a grim intuition, finally moved toward the barn. As they entered the stable, the light was dim. There, in the passage leading to the hayloft, they made the discovery that would shock the whole of Germany.
In a gruesome tableau, stacked haphazardly beneath a layer of hay or wood, lay the 4 bodies from the older generation. The sight was horrific, the victims all killed by violent blows to the head. The 3 men immediately realized they were standing in a massacre.
The news of the massacre spread like wildfire. Before any professional police from the district could arrive, scores of onlookers descended upon Hinterkaifeck. This influx of people was devastating for the investigation. They trampled through the house, moved objects, and contaminated the crime scene beyond repair. They even cooked and ate meals in the kitchen. Any pristine forensic evidence that might have existed was thoroughly destroyed in those initial hours. The police immediately formed a theory: robbery. But this theory quickly collapsed. A large amount of money was found undisturbed in the house. This was not a robbery. This was something far more personal, far more sinister. The killer had stayed not to loot, but to live. The frustrated investigation, searching for the ghost. The Hinterkaifeck murders immediately became a national fixation. The police investigation would be exhaustive, lasting decades, but ultimately proving fruitless. The total number of suspects questioned over the years would eventually exceed 100. Initial efforts focused on the family's complicated personal life. One of the first major suspects was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, reported killed in World War I. However, his body was never recovered. Rumors persisted that he had survived, returned to Germany as a shell-shocked veteran, and sought revenge. Police investigated, but they could never conclusively prove that Carl Gabriel was alive, let alone the killer. Another key person of interest was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who discovered the bodies. Schlittenbauer had been Victoria's lover and was the one to whom Victoria had confessed the true paternity of the young child, that Joseph was Andreas's. Schlittenbauer was repeatedly investigated, but was eventually dismissed due to lack of concrete evidence and a solid alibi. As the years passed, other theories emerged. 2 brothers from a nearby village, a pair of wandering, paranoid siblings, even a former farmhand who harbored a grudge. Each lead, each suspect, was scrutinized and eventually dismissed. The case would not break. The killer left no motive that could be understood by the police. The murder was not for money. It was not a clear crime of passion. It was an extermination. Methodical, brutal, and then immediately followed by the bizarre act of the killer staying for days, caring for the livestock and feeding themselves, as if the deaths were merely part of a new routine. The lingering theories. What happened? The Hinterkaifeck case has never been solved. It stands as a chilling testament to the persistence of an invisible killer. In 2007, the case was revisited by students at the Furstenbrook Police Academy using modern forensic techniques. Their conclusion, although disheartening, was final. The sheer volume of time, the contamination of the crime scene, and the loss of key evidence meant the case was unlikely to ever yield a definitive answer. Yet the lack of a solution has only fueled the most popular and persistent theories. Theory 1. The incest-related murder and revenge. This theory focuses on the complicated familial dynamic and the possibility of revenge or a desperate attempt to silence the family's secrets. The killer could be the alleged returning husband, Carl Gabriel, furious over the incest in the family's lies. Or it could be a rejected suitor, or a neighbor who felt personally wronged by the Gruber family's actions. Theory 2. The Stalker Hermit. The most compelling evidence lies in the bizarre prelude, the former maid's complaint of footsteps in the attic,
the inexplicable newspaper, and the footprints in the snow that led to the house, but not away. This suggests the killer was living inside the farmhouse, perhaps in the attic or a crawl space, for days, weeks, or even months before the murder. The killer's ability to live in the house for 3 days after the murders, feeding the animals and staying warm, indicates familiarity with the rhythm of the farm and an incredibly cold-blooded disposition. They were already occupying the space. The murders were simply the final act of clearing their new residence.
Theory 3. Murder-suicide and cover-up. A less discussed but equally grim theory suggests one of the family members was the killer. The problem here is the difficulty of one person killing 6 others, including an adult man, and then neatly arranging the bodies and the scene, only to have their own death remain a mystery. The absence of a clear motive is what makes this case a landmark in unsolved crime. The killer's behavior was unique. They killed everyone to prevent discovery, yet performed the daily chores of the people they just murdered. This suggests that the farm, the act, or the occupation of the space was the end goal. The legacy of the farmhouse. The Hinterkaifeck murders cast a long, dark shadow. The farmstead, already a source of local superstition, became a place of profound dread. People refused to approach the site. For years, the 6 victims were buried in a nearby cemetery. The farm itself stood vacant for a year, its chilling contents left exactly as they were found, before the decision was made to demolish the structure completely in 1923. Neighbors bought the property, pulled the house and barn down brick by brick, and planted a new house on the site. Today, nothing remains of the original Hinterkaifeck farmstead. The very soil was disturbed in an attempt to erase the memory of the horrific events that took place there. Despite the physical obliteration of the farm, the mystery endures. Over 100 suspects were investigated over 60 years. Detectives traveled across Europe pursuing tenuous leads. Yet the final, terrifying truth remains locked within the walls of a farmhouse that no longer exists. Who was the killer? Was it an act of personal, sexual revenge? Was it a desperate feral man driven to violence after being discovered living secretly in the attic? Was it a combination of both? We can only speculate. The story of Hinterkaifeck is a chilling reminder of the evil that can exist in the world, an evil so profound and inexplicable that it resists every attempt to bring it to light. The 6 lives lost that terrible spring evening in 1922 are a constant, ghostly presence in the annals of true crime. They were silenced by a killer who slipped through the shadows, leaving behind only the most baffling, gruesome, and enduring mystery in German history. The case is closed, but the mystery is eternal. And somewhere, out there in the quiet German countryside, the spirit of the nameless killer of Hinterkaifeck remains a silent, chilling question mark.